I am Serena Marsh, 37 years old, and I just learned a bitter lesson. A house can be stolen right out from under you while you are deployed overseas wearing a uniform to guard the very country that prints the property. Deeds. I spent 10 grueling years tightening my belt for one single purpose. A weathered house on the coast for my parents, Walter and Joan, two people who had been married for 50 years and poor for pretty much every single one of them. I closed on the house from a military base halfway across the world. I flew home carrying the key in my breast pocket, planning to place it in their hands on the exact day of their golden anniversary. But when I pulled the rental car up that familiar gravel drive, the sight that hit me tore my guts out. My mother was standing on the porch, sobbing into her hands. My father sat paralyzed on the steps, his hands shaking over two battered old suitcases, and the woman I called my mother-in-law was standing above them, pointing a finger right in my mother's face, screaming at the top of her lungs. "This is our house. Get out." There were 3 strange cars parked in the yard. My husband's family had brazenly moved in while I was on deployment. The second I set my heavy duffel bag down on the wooden boards, I didn't even know yet how they had butchered the inside of the house or where the massive amounts of cash they were pulling in were actually going. My parents got married in 1975. Their entire net worth back then was $40 and a borrowed pickup truck. My entire childhood was soaked in the smell of lemon oil. My mother scrubbed and polished furniture for rich people, her calloused hands always reeking of that chemical citrus. My father fixed broken tractors in a gravel lot outside of town. We never knew what a good year or a bad year looked like. We just had lean years. And leaner ones, when I was 9, we scraped together enough to drive out to the coast for the very first time. My mother gripped the railing, squeezed her eyes shut, and just listened to the roar of the waves. She whispered, "Wouldn't that be something to fall asleep to that?" I never forgot it. I went to college on an Army scholarship because it was the only door that opened for a broke kid like me. Logistics officer, then captain, then major. I learned how to move fuel, food, and human lives across barren deserts without ever being allowed to lose my temper. And I hoarded cash like the war might end my paycheck tomorrow. 10 years of it. Deployment hazard, pay a tiny inheritance, every single bonus lumped together. Last spring, I finally closed on a massive weather-beaten wooden house sitting on a bluff overlooking the Pacific. $425,000. The deed had one name on it. Mine. The house had a wraparound porch facing the ocean wind and a kitchen big enough for my mother to fill with that familiar lemon oil scent. The plan was flawless. Drive my parents up for the big 50th party, press the key into my mother's palm, and watch her close her eyes to the sound of the water. I should have known that no plan ever survives contact with reality. During the last 2 months of my tour, the internet connection was garbage. My husband Kyle volunteered to handle the house prep. Hire cleaners, seal the porch, get it ready for the big day. It was the only genuinely helpful thing he had offered to do in years, and I was grateful. That should have been my first red flag. The utility bills started to spike. Water, electricity, trash. They climbed the way bills climb when way too many people are crammed under one roof. I asked Kyle about it on a static-filled call. He mumbled something about running the heat to dry the paint. I asked for the login to check the accounts myself. He said, sure, then completely ghosted the request. And then I flew home. I rented a car at Portland Airport, still wearing my uniform drove 2.5 hours down the coast. I rolled the windows down, breathing in the heavy salt air, rehearsing the key hand off in my head like a mission briefing. The key felt heavy in my pocket. The road cut through the spruce trees, and then the ocean ripped open flat and silver on my left. I almost cried right behind the wheel. She was finally going to get her dream, but then I made the final turn onto the gravel. My foot slipped right off the gas pedal. A folding sign was staked directly into my mother's flower bed. Bright, cheerful red letters reading guest parking. And the brass hook on the porch, the one where my father had hung a set of anniversary wind chimes with his own shaking hands, was completely bare. Laughter echoed from inside the house. It was not family laughter. It was the polite, loud laughter of strangers who had paid money to be there. My stomach dropped. The word guest on that sign had absolutely no business being anywhere near my parents' front door. I walked up the steps. My mother, 72 years old, in her faded blue cardigan, was pressing a hand hard over her mouth to muffle her own crying. My father could not even stand up. And Brenda stormed out, holding a glass of wine at 11 in the morning, barking orders like the queen of the castle. 20 years of military discipline is the only thing that kept me grounded. Every cell in my body wanted to grab Brenda by the throat and launch her over the railing. But I did not. I slowly set my bag down. I let the dead silence do the heavy lifting. Brenda finally noticed me. The wine glass in her hand tipped. Serena. She choked on my name, but this woman still had no clue whose name was actually stamped on the legal title. She was about to endure the longest afternoon of her miserable life, and I was going to serve it to her piece by quiet piece. I pushed past her and walked inside. Kyle was standing dead center in the living room. The second we locked eyes, his face completely fell apart. The house reeked of violation. The cheap chemical lemon stench of discount hotel cleaners mixed with bleach, cheap brass numbers were screwed into the bedroom doors. Down the hall, in the kitchen, I had dreamed of giving my mother. There was a folding table, a guest book, a basket of cheap coffee pods, and a laminated sign that read, "Check in at 3 in the afternoon." Dustin, Kyle's brother, scurried out of the hallway, balancing a stack of folded white towels on his arm like a cheap bellhop. He slammed on the brakes so hard, a towel slipped off. Kyle finally found his voice weak and trembling. "Serena, honey, you are home early." I looked at the numbers on the doors. I looked at the check-in sign. I looked at my pathetic husband. "You are running it like a hotel." I stated it. It was not a question. The panicked look that darted between Kyle and Dustin told me everything. My husband was not a bystander. He was a partner in the theft. They all braced themselves, waiting for the explosion, waiting for me to scream. But that is the thing about people who scream. They only know how to defend against more screaming. So I gave them nothing. I turned on my heel, walked back to the porch, and crouched in front of my dad. "Dad, we are going to go find a clean room with decent beds, and you are going to sleep tonight." He tried to apologize. I cut him off. I carried their bags to my rental car, walked right past Brenda, and drove them to a shabby little motel 15 minutes down the highway. That night, after my dad's shaking hands finally went still in his sleep, I sat under a buzzing neon sign in the parking lot with a yellow legal pad. I did the only thing I know how to do when the wreckage is too heavy to lift. I made a list who was in my house, who posted the listing, and most importantly, whose pockets was the cash flowing into. The next morning, I found Paula Renner, a sharp real estate attorney working above a bait shop. I slid the deed across her desk. Just my name. Paula looked over her reading glasses. Here's the bad news. In Oregon, if someone establishes residency, you cannot just change the locks and toss their garbage on the lawn. That is a self-help eviction, and it is highly illegal. You have to file a formal eviction. It takes weeks. It is slow, but it is bulletproof. She paused, her eyes narrowing. But you said they are renting rooms online. That is a different beast. That requires a county permit and transient lodging taxes. If they are unlicensed, you have massive leverage. I had walked in bracing for a street brawl. I walked out with a weaponized process. I fight best by the book. That night, my parents finally told me the rest. They had arrived on the scheduled date. Dustin greeted them, claimed there was a scheduling overlap, and asked them to crash in the backyard storage shed just for the busy season. My parents, who would rather die than be a burden, agreed. Brenda banned my mother from the kitchen so she would not confuse the paying guests. My mother, who wiped down tables her whole life just to earn her own, was banished from it. And my father, he climbed on a chair, his hands shaking violently, and took down his own anniversary, wind chimes hiding them in a dish towel, all because a guest complained about the noise. My dad looked at me, tears in his eyes. I am sorry, Bug. I did not want to make trouble for you. Any lingering grief I had evaporated. It was replaced by a cold surgical fury. Nobody is making trouble for me, Dad. I make trouble. That is literally my job. I dug into the internet. I found the listing, Coastal Retreat, sleeps 8, $340 a night. Host Dustin. I scrolled down and saw a picture of the rundown shed in the backyard. The caption read, "Owner storage, please do not disturb." They had turned my parents into storage items. Where was the money going? Back at the house, I spotted a final bank notice addressed to Kyle. Red ink. He was $60,000 in the hole. His contracting business had tanked. His lifeline was my house. Kyle came to my motel on Friday night. He confessed to the debt, the lies, the shame of being out-earned by his wife. And then instead of begging my parents for forgiveness, he had the absolute nerve to ask if I could just let it go. He said it is marital property anyway. Half of it is basically mine. He was not just drowning. He was trying to pull my family down with him and calling it sharing. I stared at the man I had loved for 9 years. I am really sorry about your debt. But I filed the court papers this afternoon. He wanted pity to buy my silence. He got pity, but he sure as hell did not get my silence. Saturday, the 50th anniversary party, I timed all 3 legal bombs to detonate on this exact day. I wanted the whole family, the neighbors, and the guests to witness the blast radius. Clean and absolute. The party was in the yard. Brenda was holding court, sipping wine, completely ignoring the bright neon code enforcement. Notice freshly taped to my front door behind her. I walked up the gravel in full dress uniform. The chatter died instantly. Every head turned. Brenda could not handle the quiet. She went on the offensive, mocking me loud enough for 50 people to hear. Well, is the major here to ruin her parents' party? Going to make a scene, I set my water cup down. I opened my folder. I laid the documents out on the table one by one. The deed, my name only, the court eviction order, the county cease and desist, the booking platform's notice of a frozen account and deleted listing. I looked at Brenda, my voice low and dead calm. I do not need to make a scene, Brenda. I am calm, and that is exactly what should terrify you. The ocean wind howled through the empty brass hook. Brenda looked at the paperwork. Her smug smile slid right off her face. She started screaming frantically, defending her hard work, using family as a shield. I let her scream. Let a yard full of people watch a hysterical thief next to a completely calm woman. I tapped the deed. There is one name on this paper. It is not Kyle's. It is mine. I bought this house with 10 years of combat pay. You are right. Someone is leaving today. Read the name on the deed and get the hell off my property before 5 o'clock. Paula, my attorney, stepped out of the crowd and confirmed every legal threat. Right on cue, a current guest named Carol stood up and loudly exposed Dustin for taking $2,000 of their money. Dustin's phone blew up with cancellation emails. His cash cow was slaughtered in real time. Cornered Brenda spit out her last venomous line. You were never really one of us. I did not flinch. You are right. I am not one of you. But I own the door. By 5 o'clock, the Voss family packed their bags in total humiliation and fled. Dustin peeled out, first terrified of the tax fraud penalties. Brenda dragged her feet, waiting for someone to beg her to stay. No one even looked at her. And Kyle, he stood frozen in the middle of the yard, belonging to no one, left completely behind. The house finally breathed. My mother walked into her kitchen, and within an hour, the warm scent of lemon oil conquered the stench of bleach. My father walked out to the porch and carefully hung his brass chimes. The wind caught them. My mother closed her eyes and smiled, exactly the way I had envisioned it for a year. The next morning on the bluff, I ended it with Kyle. I refused to pay his debts. I filed for divorce. Loving someone does not mean handing them the keys to everything you have built just so they can trample it into the dirt. Sometimes the kindest, fiercest thing you can do is carve your name onto the deed and never let anyone take it away. That is my story. A house bought with blood and sweat, and a deed with only one name on it. Mine